way they relate to Israel. And after that, we will hear from Professor Ken Goldstein, who's a professor of politics at the University of San Francisco, and he will present the main findings from a landmark vast study done by the Jewish Agency, also on American Jews, and his focus again will be mostly on American Jews in Israel. I can see now that we are joined by President-elect and Chairman of the Jewish Agency, Yitzhak Herzog. Mr. Herzog, it's a pleasure and an honor. Please.
First of all, wait, let me just get in properly, okay?
Okay,
see
sure.
the entire gallery. Okay, good. So first of all, thank you. I assume Yedidia is there as well? Yeah, I see it. Professor Stern, thank you very much. And the board of JPPI and dear friends, and thank you, Mr. Rosner, for opening this session. So yes, I am speaking in two hats here. On the one hand, as the outgoing chairman of the executive of the Jewish Agency, I don't know how many of you are aware, but JPPI was founded by the Jewish Agency. We have enormous respect for JPPI, and we truly believe in its mission, and we believe it has to go from strength to strength. And under the new leadership of Professor Stern and the team, I'm sure it will advance and enlarge its scope of activities to serve the Jewish people. And secondly, as true as was mentioned, I will enter my position as the next president of the State of Israel on July 7th. And I'm working parallel, both preparing for the new position as well as relieving of my duties at the Jewish Agency. In between all of this, a few other things happened. And one of them is the publication of the Pew Report, which, it came out both during Operation Guardian of the Walls in Gaza, as well as my election process for president. But I did have an opportunity to delve into it and found it extremely interesting, in a way continuing previous reports in terms of the direction where things are going in North America. Also, in adjacent to a report, an analysis, a summary of a poll which the Jewish Agency commissioned before just last year, which showed certain trends. And it simply, Pew is so big, it's 250 pages, that it complemented these directions, including the fact that on the one hand, you have many more unaffiliated and many more secular Jews. On the other hand, strengthening the ultra-Orthodox and Orthodox elements of the Jewish communities in North America, meaning the famous center of traditionalism in a way eroded. So this is all extremely interesting and requires, revisiting and seeing how strategy meets these goals. But it's the Pew as a tool brings enormous knowledge to us to analyze. And I believe now that this meeting, this gathering, and JPPI's work with its excellent team have to break it down to elements which can serve strategy to help the Jewish people, as well as members of the Jewish communities and the federations themselves, for future years to come. And I see here many friends from the various communities, and I want to welcome you, and I believe it's going to be an outstanding platform to discuss these developments. Anyway, thank you all for your best wishes, and I definitely look forward to working with JPPI also in my next capacity as the President of Israel.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Herzog. I'm sure everybody will join me in congratulating you for being elevated to this very important position, in wishing you great success in the next 7 years. I know it sounds like a long time, but in the 7 years as a president of the State of Israel. With your permission, we will now...
I will just add, of course, that it's very important for me to thank Dr. Ken Goldstein, who conducted the research on behalf of the Jewish Agency, as well as Lara Bashkov, the director of our of our marketing worldwide. That report of Ken Goldstein was, as I said, in our eyes, the cornerstone of our strategy, which coincided with the Pew Report.
And that is great because we are going to hear from Professor Goldstein in exactly 15 minutes. But first, we have a distinguished guest, the head of the director of religion research on the Pew Research Center. He was kind enough to prepare remarks for us focused on the relations between American Jews and Israel. I should say that on our website, on JPPI's website, we will post Mr. Cooperman's remarks in their full length. He taped more than the time allocated for this session, but you could see his full remarks on our webpage, including for Hebrew speakers, the video with Hebrew subtitles so that Israelis could also learn something about the American Jewish community. JPPI also got a special permission from the Pew Research Center to translate the summary of the report to Hebrew. So on the Hebrew website of JPPI, Israelis can read the Pew Report on American Jews in Hebrew, learn more about this community, and I think that this is part of an important educational mission that JPPI also had. So now let's begin with Alan.
Hello, friends at JPPI. I'm Alan Cooperman. I'm the Director of Religion Research at the Pew Research Center in Washington, D.C. I'm very glad to be with you. Thank you to Shmuel Rossner and others who invited me to give you a quick presentation on the results of our 2020 survey of American Jews. I'm going to walk through at Shmuel's request, particularly some of the findings about attitudes toward Israel. As I do this, I'm going to be paying particular attention to three patterns: differences by age cohorts, differences between Jewish denominations, such as Orthodox, conservative, and Reform Jews, and differences by political party. These differences are clearly interrelated. There's a higher share of Orthodox Jews among younger Americans, and a higher share of Orthodox Jews are Republican than among Jews in general. And these patterns probably will not surprise you because we also saw them in the 2013 study. I'm not in position to contend that these patterns are sharper or larger than they were in 2013. Those kinds of judgments are clouded by methodological differences. There are some, broadly speaking, signs of stability in the survey. The US population of Jews is quite stable as a share of the total US adult population at a little more than 2%. The branch identification of Jews or denominational attachments of Jews are very similar to what they were in 2013. All those are pretty similar to what they were in 2013, but below the surface, we do see evidence within the survey of some kinds of change. One of the important ones is a rising share of younger Jews who identify as Orthodox. And in fact, in that 17% of Jewish adults under the age of 30 who are Orthodox, the majority of them identify as Haredi in some way, either as Hasidic or as Litvish or one of the other Haredi subgroups in the US population. At the same time, the share of younger Jews who identify as conservative or Reform is declining. It's lower than it is among older age cohorts quite considerably. And the share who don't identify with any particular branch of American Judaism is rising by age cohort. Another way of thinking about the same data is to look at the binary distinction between Jews by religion and Jews of no religion. We see by age cohort among younger cohorts a declining share of people who identify with the Jewish religion, and rising shares who identify as culturally or ethnically Jewish, but not with the Jewish religion. And again, to be clear, the Jews of no religion do not identify with any other religion. These are not Christians, Buddhists, Hindus, or any other religious group. They're people who identify as atheist, agnostic, or nothing in particular, and do consider themselves Jewish aside from religion. This is what we call a dot plot. It compresses a lot of information into a single page, and each dot and each color represents an age cohort. If the dots are close together, they indicate that there are few differences by age. If the dots are far apart, they indicate that there are substantial differences by age. And what I want you to see is that on a variety of questions about Israel, the age differences are substantial. The dots are far apart, and generally following a simple pattern, which is that the younger age cohorts are lower in their levels of attachment or connection to Israel, and lower in their levels of political approval for Israel's leadership at the time of the survey, as well as less opposed to the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement, and less likely to say that God gave the land of Israel to the Jewish people. Drilling in a little bit on this, let's look in particular at a question about whether American Jews have a lot in common with Israel, with Jews in Israel, some, not much, or nothing at all. The darkest shade on these bars represents the share who say they have a lot in common with Jews in Israel. You'll see overall that in the very top bar that about 1 in 5 American Jews say they have a lot in common with Jews in Israel. And a majority of American Jews, close to 6 in 10, say they have either a lot or some in common. And you'll see that Jews by religion are much more likely than Jews of no religion to say they have a lot in common, and that Orthodox Jews are more likely than conservative, Reform, or Jews who don't identify with any particular branch of American Judaism to say they have a lot in common with Jews in Israel. This pattern is repeated across many of these questions with different figures, but the same general pattern. For example, when we ask about travel to Israel, we'll see that overall, about a quarter of American Jews have been to Israel more than once, and it's close to half of American Jews who've been to Israel at least once. Jews by religion, again, more likely to have done so. Jews of no religion, least likely to have done so. Orthodox Jews, most likely to have done so. Same pattern comes to emotional attachment to Israel. The darkest part of these bars represents those who say they are very attached, very emotionally attached to the Jewish state. Among Jews by religion, about a third say that. Among Jews of no religion, just 6% say that. By political party, Republicans more likely to say they're very attached to Israel than Democrats. Again, there are more Orthodox among the Republicans, more Republicans among the Orthodox. So these are very interrelated patterns. And you also see that Jews who've been to Israel are more likely to say they're emotionally attached to Israel. This is, however, a bit of a chicken and egg question. It could be that it's a result of having been to Israel, but it could also be that people who are more emotionally attached to Israel are more likely to have made the trip. So this doesn't prove causality, though it is consistent with a hypothesis that programs like Birthright, et cetera, may be having an impact on Jews who go to Israel. And there's additional research to be done in this area, which we are working on, and some of our colleagues are also working on. Overall, about nearly half, 45% of American Jews say that caring about Israel is essential to what being Jewish means to them. And altogether, 8 in 10 American Jews say it's at least important or essential. Interestingly, conservative Jews are as likely as Orthodox Jews or maybe slightly more likely on this measure to say that caring about Israel is essential to what being Jewish means to them. We asked the same question that we did in 2013 about US policy toward Israel. Is the US policy too supportive of Israel, not supportive enough of Israel? Where's the level of US policy about right? Jews by religion are less likely to say that the US is too supportive of Israel. The darkest bar here represents those who say the US is too supportive of Israel. We see those who don't identify with any branch of American Judaism are the most likely to say that the US is too supportive of Israel. And Democrats, Democratic Jews are more likely than Jews who are Republican or lean Republican to say the US is too supportive of Israel. American Jews remain optimistic that a way can be found for Israel and an independent Palestinian state to coexist in peace. This is kind of our two-state solution question. Jews by religion are a little less optimistic about a two-state solution than Jews of no religion. Democratic-leaning Jews are more optimistic than Republican-leaning Jews. And Jews in the less traditional or more liberal branches of American Judaism, Reform and no particular branch, are more optimistic than Orthodox Jews. We also asked the same question as in 2013 about whether the Israeli government is making a sincere effort toward a peace settlement with the Palestinians, and whether the Palestinian leadership is making a sincere effort toward a peace settlement with Israel. And we find that minorities of American Jews feel that either the Israeli government is sincere or the Palestinians are sincere. You do see one very notable group in which a majority feel the Israeli government is sincere, and that's Republican-leaning Jews and Orthodox Jews as well. We asked for the first time a question about the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. We did not attempt to explain what that movement is. We did base the question on those who said they at least have heard something or a lot about BDS. So we first asked whether respondents have heard about BDS, and if they had heard about BDS, then we asked them whether they support it or oppose it. Again, we didn't explain what BDS is other than to use the name of the movement. So we find that a lot of American Jews have not heard, say they have not heard about BDS, and therefore they weren't asked whether they oppose or support it. These numbers are based on the total Jewish population. So 10% of American Jews overall say they support the BDS movement, 43% oppose it, including a third who say they strongly oppose it. Those numbers rise sharply, the opposition numbers among the Orthodox and conservative populations. So among Orthodox Jews, 70% oppose it and 2/3 strongly oppose BDS. And among Republicans, Jews who lean Republican or identify as Republicans, more than half say they oppose the BDS movement, including 54% who say they strongly oppose it. The most support for BDS is found among Jews of no religion and Jews who don't identify with any particular branch of Judaism. Those two groups are highly overlapping. And we asked some questions about Trump's handling of US policy toward Israel. The survey took place during the final approximately 14 months of Trump's term. In the run-up to the election, it was not yet clear who would win the US election at the time the survey took place. And at that time, overall, a majority of American Jews rated Trump's handling of US policy toward Israel as only fair or poor. And when we look at this by partisanship, it really pops. The differences are huge. Overwhelmingly, Republicans and those who lean Republican in the Jewish population gave Trump excellent ratings, whereas among Democrats and those who lean Democrat, the majority gave Trump only fair or poor ratings for his handling of policy toward Israel. We also asked a couple of interesting questions, parallel questions, about whether Americans viewed Donald Trump as friendly toward Israel, or neutral, or unfriendly toward Israel. And similarly, whether Americans viewed Trump as friendly, neutral, or unfriendly toward American Jews. And what's interesting here, I think, is that on the whole, American Jews did see Trump as friendly toward Israel. Even among Democrats, the majority saw him as friendly or neutral toward Israel, and only a minority saw him as unfriendly. But on the question of attitudes towards Jews in the United States, we see much more skepticism about Trump's attitudes towards Jews. And indeed, among Jewish Democrats, only a minority thought that Trump was actually truly friendly toward American Jews. Large majorities of Orthodox did feel that Trump was friendly both to Israel and to Jews in the United States. And that's the end of the brief descriptive overview of our findings, particularly on questions toward Israel. There's a great deal more information in the survey. You can find it in the report on our webpage at pewresearch.org. And you also have my email address if you wish to contact me, acooperman@pewresearch.org. Thanks again to my friends and colleagues at JPPI, and thank you for all the great work that you've done on Jewish demography and sociology in Israel, in the United States, and around the world. Thank you for your interest in our work.
And we thank Alan Cooperman and the Pew Research Center for their cooperation with us. And we urge you, of course, to go to their website and read the full report. It's only 250-page long, filled with interesting data. And we remind you that on our website, on the JPPI website, you can see Alan Cooperman's full presentation with the graphs and all the data that he presented, and also to urge people to read the Hebrew translation of the report on our Hebrew website. We now turn to a person who that was already mentioned a few times before. Ken Goldstein conducted the Jewish Agency study that we would like to hear about. Professor Goldstein is a professor of politics at the University of San Francisco and the founding director of the USF in DC program. Professor Goldstein, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you very much for the words of introduction, and thank you very much for the kind words of introduction to President-elect Herzog. Just sort of a little personal note, I have a memory when I was 11 years old of my grandfather briefing Ambassador Herzog in New York. And so it's a real kick for me to be here getting to brief President-elect Herzog many years later. Thanks to Alan Cooperman, or the virtual Alan Cooperman, for that presentation and the good work of Pew. It is an incredibly valuable data set, both substantively and methodologically. Professors like disagreeing with each other, researchers like disagreeing with each other, but there is very little that I disagree with in terms of his presentation. And one thing I would just point out is the cuts or crosstabs or breaks that he identified in the interactions between age, denomination, party ID, Jews by religion and no religion really are the key things to look at, but also the interactions between the two. And I'm going to get at that a little bit. Listen, one of the reasons why the Pew research is so valuable is there has been lots of scholarly work on Jews. In recent years, there has not been many scholarly surveys on Jews in America nationally. There's been lots of community studies by different communities, but the reason why Pew is so important is the Pew study in, I guess, 2013, and then the most recent Pew study have really been some of the only nationally public available data. And the Pew work, like any work, is a snapshot in time. And Pew went into the field in November of 2019, as Alan mentioned, and I was sort of just trying to jot down or come up with all the things that have happened since November of 2019, right? Democratic primaries, COVID, the shutting down of the United States and community life, George Floyd, the presidential election, the post-election drama in the United States, the attack on the US Capitol, Biden's first 100 days, the vaccine, not one Israeli election, but 2 Israeli elections. And actually, if the survey had started 2 months before, it would have been 3 Israeli elections. The most recent conflict in Gaza, and now Bibi Netanyahu out. So a lot has happened in the last 2 years. A lot has also happened in the last couple decades in the United States. And let me start with a piece of data here, not from me, not from Pew, and not about Jews, but looking at church membership in the United States. So there's lots of ways to measure religiosity, and we only have a brief amount of time here. But you see a significant decline in church membership in the United States. For 60, 70 years, very steady, about 70%, and then dropping significantly in the last couple decades. And you see that drop uniform among age groups, but you also see the aggregate level among young people even lower, right? So older folks had a drop, but that drop went from 77 to 66. If you compare millennials, their level of church going, only one measure of religious engagement, but that is 36%. I'm a political scientist, and I mostly pay attention to political science, not a demographer, but I pay attention to political demography in this country. Very important book a couple years ago by a scholar named Rui Teixeira called The Changing Face of the American Electorate. Might have been misinterpreted a little bit to mean that demographics was absolute destiny, as Hillary Clinton learned it was not in 2016. But there have been profound changes in the face of the American electorate, in the demography of the United States, that have upped the weight of certain groups in American life and reduced the weight of other groups in American life. So that is the pot, that is the soup in which Jewish Americans are living. And these are data from Pew, which break out the Jews of no religion and Jews by religion, and then also show those breaks by age group. So giving you a little bit more of an interaction of what Alan thought about. So now let me finally get to showing you a couple things from the Jewish agency, work. There's often a lot of drama about studies of Jewish Americans, which might be one of the reasons why there have been relatively few studies of Jewish Americans, and some pretty profound methodological debates. But at the end of the day, this shows you a summary, it's not the prettiest slide I've ever made, of the Jewish agency work, which we did in October of 2019 and August of 2020, work by AJC in 2019, 2020, and 21, and then the most recent Pew work. And even though they're different studies with different methodologies done by different organizations with different goals, some for internal, some for publicity, some for more scholarly, the consistency is striking on what I would say are the 2 key variables. I'm always a little embarrassed to say this as a scholar of American politics who has spent most of my life studying this. And as I always tell my students, we can make this very complicated, but if you want to understand American politics, I can give you this brilliance. Democrats vote for Democrats and Republicans vote for Republicans. Party ID is the single most important factor, Captain Obvious here, of understanding American political behavior and attitudes. And for American Jews, the key word there is American. And the single most important factor in understanding the attitudes of American Jews on almost everything political in the United States is their partisanship. And their partisanship has been and is consistently overwhelmingly Democratic, as Alan said, with some variance by denomination, with Orthodox more likely to be Republican. Another, and at the risk of being Captain Obvious, core question that Pew asked in 2013 and that we asked on our studies is, how important is being Jewish to you? So Pew breaks it out in a very transparent fashion: Jews by religion, Jews by no religion. They also have other additional data which you can look at. In the same way that party ID is the single most important factor in understanding the attitudes of Jewish Americans on almost every issue political in the United States, understanding attitudes about Jewish matters and about Israel, whether or not you think Jewish is very important to you, is the single largest driver. Let me make another point here, which is sort of for all you Sherlock Holmes fans out there, the dog that's not barking. Surveys of Jewish Americans ask questions about Jewish stuff. If you asked a general survey or a survey of Jews, the most important problems facing the United States, the most important problem facing them, how big a problem is Israel, or how big a concern is Israel and all the things they're worrying about, it probably would not even make the top 10 of issues. It would be healthcare and COVID and roads and bridges and all the other things that typically concern Americans. This is a summary of the Pew data. And again, you do see profound differences in not so much party ID, but not surprisingly, people who identify as Jews as a religion by an overwhelming margin, they say being Jewish is more important to them than people who are Jews of no religion. So Alan provided lots of information, lots of crosstabs, lots of cuts, and I don't have lots of time here. We have a report, not quite 250 pages, a little bit shorter, so maybe you can get through it. That Lara and the good folks, the Jewish Agency, can share with you. And I know Shmuel and others are also going to do some analysis as well. But we think the interactions of those cuts are very interesting, and you see this younger group, which is both more Orthodox than the lower group and also more no particular branch than older people, right? So a greater proportion of young people are either Orthodox or not tied to a denomination. And as we've discussed before, these younger people are also much less likely to identify as Jewish by religion. So we broke out some crosstabs combining and looking at the young non-Orthodox group. So let me be clear, I'm not ignoring Orthodox people. I'm not saying young Orthodox people are not important. But as a demographic, when I'm looking for differences, young non-Orthodox is a key group that I'm sure lots of Jewish organizations are concerned with, and lots of you who think about Jewish peoplehood. And these are some of the differences between the population, Jewish population as a whole, Jewish American population as a whole, and young non-Orthodox. So we asked a question: how necessary is a nation state for the Jewish people? Overall, 87% of Jewish Americans said it was necessary. And I often like to look at the most intense answers, the varies, with 68% saying it was very necessary. Depends if you're a glass half full or a glass half empty person. Among young non-Orthodox, the overall number is only slightly less. The margin between necessary and not necessary is tighter. But I look at that very number, and among young non-Orthodox, 46% say very necessary versus 68% of the population as a whole. And I should also point out that that population as a whole also includes those young non-Orthodox. So that number would even be a little bit higher among that orange group there, for want of a better word. Do you have a favorable or unfavorable opinion of Israel? We asked that question in 2019 and 2020, very consistent results. 4 out of 5 Jewish Americans saying they have a favorable opinion of Israel. Among Younger non-Orthodox also have a favorable opinion of Israel, but that number is 60-30, 2-to-1, rather than 4 or 5-to-1, a 28 percentage point margin rather than a 66 percentage point margin. Again, are you half glass full, half glass empty person? There's also a lot of thought, and I'm not an expert in this area like many of you are, and some debate about whether young people are naturally going to change their attitudes as they get older, or whether these are actually profound cohort differences, or whether they are generational differences or that will change over time. We also asked a question about how important Israel was as an ally to the United States. And this is called an informed ballot, which people sometimes use in politics. You give people an argument for and an argument against. One argument, Israel shares American values and is of key strategic importance to the United States. Usually I don't like doing double-barreled questions, but I'm doing this in the package of a message. Versus Israel is a monetary burden on the US and hurts our relations with other countries. By a large margin, Jewish Americans think Israel shares its values. Young non-Orthodox also think that's the case, but at proportions and margins that are much less. So I mentioned that there's some debate, I believe, in the Jewish world among folks who do what you do about whether it's always the case that young people are less involved with religion, less involved with community, less involved with Israel, and that they will naturally go up over time. That's an empirical question. But let me end by showing you some data that I did not do for the Jewish agency, that is hot off the presses, as I think when there were presses and newspapers, they used to say, that a friend of mine at Momentive asked. This is a survey that came out of the field last night. 10,000 interviews, not of Jewish Americans, but of Americans as a whole. And I should also say for my media friends here, this is off the record for now. This is the shares values versus Israel's a burden, the exact same question. Could also share some time series data if folks want to chat afterwards. The margin is 19 percentage points, which is a decline from what I've seen in the past. The number of don't knows has gone up, and Democrats are now underwater. So you have a partisan gap of 55 points. Democrats -3, Republicans +52, and younger Democrats are at -34. So the point of this very valuable seminar this morning is not necessarily to talk about this topic, but this is the pot, the soup, the ether, the oxygen which Jewish Americans are living in now. So I think I hit the 15 minutes. Appreciate, which is a world record for me. Appreciate your time. Hope you get a chance to read the report, and very much appreciate all the good work that's being done here.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you so much. Overcoming the temptation to publish the data you just showed us is going to be a challenge for me, but I'll try to get over it. Moving forward to a very brief analysis from a few people. We begin with 3 JPPI scholars, first of which is a sociologist, senior fellow at the Jewish People Policy Institute, Dr. Shlomo Fisher, please.
Okay, good morning. The recent Pew Report, Jewish Americans 2020, highlighted the polarization and disassociation of various sectors of the American Jewish community. They asked a very interesting question, which was how much in common do the various sectors have? So here we see on this table that 60% of the Reform respondents and 75% of the respondents who have no particular denomination said that they have nothing or not much in common with Orthodox Jews. Similarly, 50% of the Orthodox said that they have nothing or not much in common with the Reform Jews. This apparently is a new phenomenon, and it seems to have to do with another new phenomenon, which is the degree of political polarization. Here we have two charts here, which sort of set up or show us the political polarization, both in regard to American politics and in regard to Israeli politics. I would like to suggest that what's really going on are two very different conceptions of Jewish identity and what I would call the Jewish position in the world. One position which is very familiar to Jews, and this has been characteristic of Jewish communities for the last 2,000 years, have been the Jews as a minority. That means as not only a statistical minority, but also as a way of looking at the world and as a form of, I would say, consciousness, it's a certain mentality that we exist on the sufferance of the majority, we don't make the rules, and we have to be protected. In modern democracies, the minority is protected by human and civil rights, and therefore Jews who think of themselves as a minority tend to form alliances with other downtrodden groups and other minorities. The other way of looking at Jewish existence is that from a majority point of view or a mainstream point of view. The Orthodox identify very deeply with the Jewish majority and the right-wing government, the former right-wing government in Israel, which frankly pursued the interests of the Jewish ethno-national majority. And they also tend to also identify with the traditional, historical, white Christian mainstream of America, in distinction from the more liberal Jews who continue to see themselves as a minority and therefore endorse liberal positions and human rights and stuff of that sort. So I would just like to summarize and submit that the distinction between the two communities goes much further than either religious practice or even political views, but rather they experience being Jewish in the world today in two very different fashions, and that's why they have very little or nothing in common. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shlomo. Our next short presentation, short analysis is going to come also from a member of the Jewish People Policy Institute staff. We will hear from Dr. Inbal Hakman. She will focus on the trends in American Jewish connection to Israel. I hope this is ready for us right now.
Good morning or good afternoon to you all. The depth and quality of relations between Israeli and diaspora Jews are on the public agenda for many years now. The new Pew Report, Jewish American in 2020, provides insights into our current point in time. The most notable difference between the current Pew data and the data from various surveys relates to whether caring about Israel is central to Jewish identity. According to Pew, 8 out of 10 Jews, 82%, say caring about Israel is an essential or important part of what being Jews mean to them. These numbers are much higher than AJC data from the last decade, or even the AJC 2021 report and Jaffe News data. The current Pew data is inconsistent with its own data from 2013, as well as the answer to other questions in the survey, like, for example, the direct question of how emotionally attached people feel they are to the state of Israel. These data suggest that the gaps are probably not due to better relations between the two communities, but rather the result of a methodological issues or different phrase of the questions and the possible answers. In other questions, such as visit in Israel, Pew findings go in line with AJC findings, both showing that 45% of American Jews visit Israel at least once. In Jeffrey's latest findings, it's 46% of American Jews. All the three of them indicate that the US Jews are still behind most other diaspora Jews. One last thing, the Pew study, unlike most studies, includes the distinct category Jews of no religions, a distinction which provides us with some profound insights. When religious identity is weak, the connection to Israel is weak as well, in almost every aspect. And still, most of the data goes in line with other surveys data and might support the worrying trend of distancing.
Thank you to Dr. Inbal Hakman. Last but not least, from JPPI, Senior Fellow, Ambassador Avi Gil. Avi, the floor is yours.
Shalom lekulam. One of the assets that gives strategic power to Israel and the Jewish people is the triangular relationship. Jerusalem, Washington, American Jewry. Say again, Jerusalem, Washington, American Jewry. During President Trump's term, an imbalance between the sides that make up the triangle was revealed. On the one hand, Jerusalem-Washington relations were outstanding, excellent. On the other hand, this was not the case in the relationship between most of American Jewry and the Trump administration, nor was the case in the Netanyahu administration's relationship with that liberal part of American Jewry. Trump's tenure significantly reinforced the ideological polarization in the United States. And one result of this was that Israel became a party-dependent issue in US politics. In a polarized American reality, it is increasingly difficult to maintain bipartisan sympathy for Israel. But let us not ignore the fact that Israel too is undergoing ideological changes. While most Jewish voters in the United States wanted to see Trump's defeat, most Jews in Israel wanted him to win the election. Now, in the wake of the changes of government in the United States and Israel, will we see a changing trend that will strengthen the strategic triangular relationship? The effect of specific figures coming or going should not be underestimated. Indeed, the new Pew research showed that out of every 10 Jews who supported the Democratic Party, 7 gave unflattering scores to Netanyahu's performance. But not everything depends on the identity of a specific leader. The geopolitical challenges before us are no less important, and perhaps even more so. Despite the gravity of the Iran problem, the Palestinian issue has, in my opinion, deeper implications because it concerns questions of values and ethics that are deeply rooted in the special relationships between Israel and the United States. The continuing occupation and the control of another people are incompatible with the liberal interpretation of these principles. Let me share with you now. The Pew research shows that only 20% of Jews who voted Democratic or leaning Democratic believe that the Israeli government is making a sincere effort to reach peace agreement, compared to 66% of Jews who voted or leaning Republican. Is the new Israeli government expected to change this picture of its own volition and launch peace initiative? The chances of these are quite low because the very existence of the government depends on maintaining the status quo on the Palestinian issue. The bottom line is, if along the way, President Biden tires of the status quo for his own reasons and decides to initiate a bold move on the Palestinian issue, it seems that most American Jews will back their president, not necessarily to the liking of Naftali Bennett and some key figures, key minister in his cabinet. In other words, the declared desire of the new Israeli government to restore the strength of the triangular relationship will sooner or later encounter a major obstacle, the Palestinian issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Avi. The last leg of our webinar will be dedicated to practitioners, people who look at the data and have to think what to do with it as they operate institutions of the Jewish world. The first speaker is Erika Rudin-Luria. She's the president of the Jewish Federation of Cleveland. Erika, if you are
Great.
with us, I can see you.
Yes, I'm here.
Oh, you are here. Wonderful.
I'm here.
So the floor is yours.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Shmuel, and thank you everyone else. So the research that we've heard this morning is clearly important research, and it's research about a group that really defies categorization, because I would suggest to us that if we were only concerned with religion, then actually none of us would be here, right? The Jewish Agency and JPPI are about the Jewish people, which makes all of these terms very, very challenging. So with that caveat, I want to highlight just a few things. We've talked about the polarization this morning. I'd suggest that the polarization has been exacerbated by COVID. It's been exacerbated, as we know, by electoral politics. And in the United States, in Cleveland as well as elsewhere, we have work to do on bringing together American Jews across denominations, across ages, across political lines. And frankly, we likely need to do this in a very different way. I know many of us have worked with Resetting the Table. One of the things that we're talking about here is forming groups that have a focus on makloket l'shem shamayim. What does it mean to bring together people and have the strength of the group be actually that we disagree with each other and that we come from differing perspectives? So that's one of the things we're thinking about on the polarization front. The other thing I'd highlight is that it was fascinating that conservative and Reform Jews feel more connected to Israeli Jews than they do to Orthodox, and same in the opposite direction. And looking at that by age, it was actually very similar across the different generations. Now, this either means that denominational politics in the United States are really horrific, or I would prefer to say that we actually have some foundations on which we can build for a stronger Klal Yisrael. I would imagine that there's a connection between commonality with Jews in Israel and feeling the need to support Jews around the world. And looking at the different generations suggests to me that it's not only because of our investment in Taglit and Masa and the Shin Shinim program and 248 and all of those programs, which in Cleveland we believe are extremely impactful, but that we have a place to build from here that could potentially help us bridge the challenges that we have within Klal Yisrael, that looking at Israel as people and not only as a country actually could give us suggestions as to strategies that we would create into the future. We always discuss intermarriage and interfaith families in these conversations, and we continue to see that more and more children are identifying with the Jewish people as adults. I think this is a place where categories and research fail us, and where we've seen that one size really doesn't fit all. I would imagine if you look during COVID that we would see even a large percentage of these families connecting online with different involvements in the Jewish community. I know in Cleveland, we have thousands of interfaith families that are engaging in a program called J-Hub. There aren't many programs like this across the country, but I know that when we put something out there that's relevant to people's lives, supports them as a family, and that is not prescriptive, then people request spiritual, meaningful involvement in Jewish education. And my final comment would just be that the bad news is that 53% of people felt less safe today than they did in prior years. And I imagine that if we took that survey today, it actually would be more than that. And I think this is a serious issue, not only for Jews in the United States or North America, but really our partners in Israel as well. And security alone is not going to address this. So the conversations we're having are both about how do we get our general community members to be educated, aware, step forward and call out anti-Semitism, but are there ways that we can go on the offensive to fight and combat anti-Semitism as a community? So I would end there.
Thank you, Erica. Shivi Greenfield is the Deputy Director General for Strategy and Planning at Jaffe. Shivi, it's your turn.
All right, thank you. So I won't speak about Israel specifically because it came here a lot, and I actually want to talk more about what it says to us about the future of the Jewish people. And I think for those who are concerned about the Jewish people 50 years from today, 100 years, 200 years, are looking at the data can be a bit depressing. I mean, because it's very, very clear almost across all indicators that the younger you are, the more likely or the less likely you are to be actively engaged in any of the forms of engagement with Israel, with Judaism, and assuming that nothing will shift, that younger people will suddenly become, just letting things happen, go on as they are. I mean, we're looking at a gradual detachment. On the other hand, but then when you look at certain of the data, I mean, some that are really remarkable, kind of out of the ordinary results, which I mean, I just want to share with you 4, which give kind of an entirely different picture. So being Jewish is important for 81% according to Jewish Agency evaluation, and 76 according to Pew, which is much more than what you'd assume just based on aggregating the different data points. Feeling a sense of belonging to the Jewish people, again, 85% say that they feel a sense of belonging. Feeling responsibility to help Jews in need around the world, 79% according to Pew. And when, according to the Jewish Agency analysis, the young generations have even expressed the need to increase that support. Okay, and finally, when we talk about, and that's a question which Michael Seeger here was responsible for formulating about the necessity of the Jewish state, of the nation state, not the Jewish state, in order kind of to be able to focus it. Then 78% of young non-Orthodox, meaning most of whom are liberal/progressive, 78 still believe that is necessary or somewhat necessary. And this reminds, so again, when we look as Jewish Agency, and I've been sharing this data with employees of the Jewish Agency, it's very easily to feel that this is too big of a task for anyone to accomplish. And maybe, everything is doomed. I mean, kind of a sense that it's too much to be able for any organization, even organization working together. On the other hand, it resembles very closely a different phenomena taking place in marriage. It's called the marriage paradox. So it's very similar trends are taking place there. Less people are getting married. Cohabitation has, by and large, replaced, to a large extent, marriage. When people marry, they marry later. And when they marry later, in increasing percentages, they divorce. And this has been taking place now for over 40 years and increasing. On the other hand, when people are asked, what are the components of good life? Marriage ranks highest, year after year after year. And a lot of sociologists have been asking, how do you reconcile between the practice and the vision? And I think what we're seeing here is something very similar. I mean, we're seeing here that the practice of Judaism or of engagement with what it means to be Jewish with Israel and so on is going down. On the other hand, the kind of a sense of the ethos, the vision of the Jewish people is still kind of very robust and sound, which is something, which tells us, first of all, it's way too early to say anything about kind of, the future is declining or anything else. And looking at the question of not being obsessed with any particular detail, but asking how do we increase this kind of sense that people do feel belong, even though they're not sure how to express it, and even if the way they do express it is many times very fluid or thin. So I think this gives us a very strong sense of hope and of optimism that ultimately there is still a very strong sense of belonging to a Jewish people that will make sure that we keep on here for a longer while.
Thank you. Optimism is a great way to end any webinar. For concluding remarks, Professor Yedidia Stern, President of JPPI, please.
Thank you, Shmuel. Thank you, everybody. This is quite a record. 10 people talked within an hour on such a big issue. Kol hakavod to everybody, and I'll try to be as short as I can. Listen, the two largest communities people clearly are undergoing dramatic changes in the last decade. In Israel, and we'll not go into details, the traditional structure of secular hegemony is being replaced by a new social order. President Rivlin presented it 7 years ago. We all know of it, and it obviously changes the Israeli society to become more conservative, more traditional, and more nationalistic. In the United States, the two surveys us very clearly, we are facing a huge change of identity for the Jews. But there is a major difference between the two communities. In Israel, the preservation of the Jewish identity is guaranteed. It is easy to understand why. Jewish identity is a default option here in Israel. The language spoken, we use the state symbols, school curriculum, the culture, everything resonates Jewishness. On the other hand, a Jew in North America must decide whether he or she wants to be Jewish or not, and what does it really mean? It can be active, it can be passive, but you have to make a decision that you want to be a Jew. Because if you do not decide that you want to be a Jew, your identity will basically disappear, at least as a meaningful factor in your life. And this is a major challenge for the Jewish Agency, for all of us, and for JPPI. This is a very important fact when we look at the next generation, as we saw, of American Jews, the young ones, as we were presented with the fact, let's say that the relationship to the state of Israel is a telling factor of the Jewish identity of people in North America. So 41% of them, of the young people under 30 who are not Orthodox, do not feel emotionally connected to Israel. Only 28% of them oppose the BDS movement. Third of them believe that Israel is a burden on the US and it hurts American relations with other countries. So I think we have to face it. There's a great wind that's shaking right now the Jewish people in the first quarter of the 21st century. Historians in the future generations will look at us and will ask how we reacted in the face of this challenge. Now, as an Israeli, and this is my last word here, as an Israeli, I believe that the state of Israel must respond. Israel has committed itself via the basic law, Israel is a nation state of the Jewish people, and I'm quoting the law. Israel will act to preserve the cultural, historical, and religious heritage of the Jewish people among Jews in the diaspora. So if we are sincere in our intentions, these two reports should serve us as a wake-up call for fulfilling that mission. Shmuel.
Thank you, Edidia. At this point, on behalf of JPPI, I would like to thank all speakers for speaking and presenting the data and their analysis. And I would like to thank all of you for your patience with the speakers and with us. I would like to thank the Jaffe's Board of Governors, the members of the Board of Governors for joining in. The webinar is now over, but for the members of